Hi, everybody. This is Adam Elenbaas from Nightlight Astrology. It's Wednesday, November 7th. Happy new moon today, everybody. We're going to be talking today about the new moon in Scorpio, as well as most of the focus actually for today will be on entrance of Jupiter into Sagittarius. This is part two. So, yesterday I made a video sort of introducing the topic, talking about some of the general significance of a slower moving planet like Jupiter entering Sagittarius, or a new sign. And we also talked in a very broad and general sense about how to read a planet when it enters a new sign, and how to pay attention to the changes in dignity and house rulership and things like that. So these are all things that you can go back to and visit in yesterday's talk. You can find it on my YouTube channel and or my Facebook page, or my website, nightlightastrology.com, and check that out. So there's a lot of basic information that was covered in the first part that if you did not already get, and you may have questions like, why isn't he talking about this or that, or something that you feel like I'm missing, check that talk out first. If there's still something missing that you'd like me to address that I'm not addressing in either the first talk or today, feel free to email me, nightlightastrology@gmail.com. Just put in, YouTube Q&A in the subject, and keep it just a short, concise question that you have, and I'll try to address it. I'm probably going to do one more talk on Jupiter's entrance into Sagittarius. So, yeah, and people have been asking, where are you live casting when you're doing this? I'm live casting from Facebook. So if you go to Adam Elenbaas on Facebook, you can find me there if you're watching this on YouTube, and you can see my live casts on YouTube. So my audience gets a little bit bigger on YouTube. I may eventually do some live streaming right to YouTube, but my Facebook audience is a lot bigger, reaches more people, so that's where I do it for now. All right, so before we dive into part two of Jupiter in Sagittarius, I want to talk briefly about this new moon in Scorpio. So let me pull up my chart here. So the new moon's just recently passed us by. It's happened just a couple of hours ago, basically. And this new moon in the middle of Scorpio is in a pretty close trine to Neptune in Pisces. So there's a lot of water in this new moon. And of course, one of the things that water does is to break down barriers and separativeness and bring things together, in unity. So you may notice in the month ahead, very generally speaking, that there is a unitive, deeper, or emotional and unitive force that's sort of driving things through the month. That's a general thing that you can pay attention to. In Scorpio, of course, this is a Mars-ruled sign. So we also have to look at where is Mars? And this new moon is going to be sort of toned by how can Mars offer something to this new moon? It's the new moon is a guest in the house of Mars. So you have Mars right now in Aquarius. So the new moon has emotional depth and this kind of unitive force behind it, bringing things together. But it also has this kind of penetrating Mars-like quality, intensity, confrontation, conflict, maybe of a more emotional nature. But then here's Mars in an air sign like Aquarius, a sort of fixed Saturn-ruled air sign. This means that there are intellectual principles at stake right now. There's, for a long time, since the middle of May, Mars has primarily, just for a little brief period, dipped out to the late Capricorn during its retrograde, but it's mostly been in Aquarius since the middle of May. And so you think of Mars in Aquarius, and you think of a group of theoretical physicists, arguing about competing models of the cosmos, or different cosmological models that they're arguing about. You get that feeling. It's vast, it's airy, it's up here, but it's also social in nature. It's sort of fired up, but it's a little sort of cerebral, and the other thing you could think about is that the Mars in Aquarius can be intensely dogmatic, and can involve this feeling of needing to stand up and advocate for ideas or thought structures or paradigms that are somehow marginalized or different or on the outside. This is the place of Saturn, and Saturn is the outlier. Saturn is the remote, distant one that's on the very edge of the known and the visible, and that which goes beyond the sort of transcendent. And so Mars is also speaking with a kind of eccentric, distant, lofty intensity since the middle of May. And there's this new moon is again sort of it's bringing those Martian qualities to bear on the moon cycle ahead. So you can think about it like that. Interestingly, on the 15th of the month, Mars will finally leave Aquarius and go into Pisces. Yeah, it's a new moon. Someone just mentioned, Betty just mentioned that the president just fired the attorney general as the new moon happened. Right. So there's a new beginning, and it's Mars. Like, what does Mars do? Cuts, severs, divides. So this new moon is, you could also say, it marks the beginning of something new that has the theme of cutting, division, aggression, confrontation, battle, war, but also desire, hunger, hunting, has that, that kind of feeling to it. Now, the interesting that the new moon is in a close trine with Neptune in Pisces might soften it a little bit, make it a little bit more magical, mystical, numinous, otherworldly, gives it also a feeling of deeper and broader emotional significance. For example, this morning at about 4 in the morning, I left my house and drove up to the mountains, basically, not the mountains, but sort of this really sort of like foothills in northern Maryland. And I went up there and I met a photographer. And the photographer was helping me take some sort of starry and sunrise photos for my new website, which I've been building for a while now, and it'll be probably out sometime in the new year. But I'm building a new website, and I did some photography with her. And so we climbed up, and it was like a 30-minute hike, and we got up to the top of this sort of huge peak, and there was fog like coming in over the tops of the foothills, and the stars out, and this sort of like just this beautiful view. And as the sun came up, and we did our photography session, and it was just a sort of deep and vast experience to take in. And as I was sitting there with the photographer, we talked for a long time just about life and about loss and aging and things like that. Not that I'm so old or anything, but just observations from being about getting closer toward like the sort of halfway point of life. And it was just like this really deep conversation as we were like taking all these really cool photos and stuff like that. And then this like must have been like a high school couple came, and they went up to the very edge of this cliff. And I'm telling you, like this cliff, if you fall, it's over. I mean, this was way up there. And they were like laying right on the edge of it. And we're trying to get our work done. And they were just laying there, just like making out. It was like really kind of awkward. And they were just laying there, and they were just like totally, making out. And the photographer was joking, and she was like, I remember when I used to be like that. Were you ever like that? And I was like, yeah, gosh, it's been a while. And we were kind of reminiscing about, what it was like before having kids, and, if like being married, having kids, like having to, like she was talking about, the grind of doing like weddings and photography. And we were talking, this was kind of just this conversation that was taking place. And this intense passion that was sitting so close to the cliff of oblivion, basically. I just sat there and I was like, oh, it was still dark moon at that point, right? It's not quite new moon. I was like, this is such a dark moon trine Neptune moment. These beautiful photographs, these lovers who are so ignorant of everything that's going to happen to them over the next 20 years of their life. And they're sitting there in this, this grand landscape, but they're just so close to falling over the edge, and it was such a beautiful like metaphor. And it just struck me. It's like, that's That's sort of what it's like to have a new moon in Scorpio trine to Neptune in Pisces. So close. There's so much depth and intensity, but also this kind of innocent, naive quality that's also there. Last night, for example, during the election, obviously I'm going to betray myself here, I have a lot of people, believe it or not, I have a lot of people who watch on both sides of the aisle, so to speak. So I try to be generous because I, at the end of the day, and I'll talk more about this later, I don't believe that, self-righteousness and vindictiveness toward those that I disagree with is a good way to go. So I try to really tone down political rhetoric in the way that I do things. Not that that doesn't mean I don't believe strongly in my own principles, but I don't want to be divisive because I believe astrology can be something that unites us. So I'm very careful about that. But I was kind of stoked for a blue wave last night. That's just me being personally honest. And there was a rainbow, a dark rainbow over the White House that was passed around last night. It poured here. I live in DC, so just outside of DC, and it was this beautiful rainbow. It was kind of dark. So it was a mixture of like ominous and rainbow. And I kind of felt like that's how last night was watching the election results later. I didn't watch them for long. I went to bed because I had to get up at 4 a.m. and go sit on a cliff. But but that was, it also felt like that last night. I was like, this is Jupiter's right on the brink, right about to turn this corner, but there's still this sort of lingering heaviness. There's some light, so for those of us who are thinking, we need an auspicious event here. Democrats win the House. For a lot of us, that's something that means a lot. And yet, sort of probably lost some seats in the Senate, whatever. So I'm sure that people on the other side also felt like it was a mixture. Like they probably didn't like losing the House or whatever. But it was such an interesting image to see the rainbow in this sort of dark rainbow over Washington. So you can think about images like that. Sometimes it's better when you're doing astrology, rather than spelling every last thing out. Here's what to expect, and here's what your inner life is going to be like. Here's the kind of events you can see in the outer world. Here's the kind of things that are likely to show up in the news. Sometimes I find that it's better to just be really observant of my experiences and look for the way that the astrology is speaking through image, because image speaks. For example, the cliff, the high school lovers, the conversation at sunrise, it was like that is an image that if I sit with it and if I allow it to be without trying to interpret it or just be like, well, that was the lovers were Scorpio and their making out was this, and they're, the cliff and the mist was Neptune, and you know what I mean? So, but just let the image speak. Give it space to be. And a lot of the times astrological transits can be best understood when you sort of live through them, but come back to touchstones in image. So find an image in your life on this new moon. It's not a bad idea because this is a deep and sort of vast new moon. And the two there at once with the trine to Neptune. So the Scorpio new moon, Neptune in Pisces, search for an image that somehow speaks to you. Hold on to that image and keep talking to it, but don't try to arrest meaning from it. Let it be alive. Let it continue to speak. That's something James Hillman talked about throughout his whole career. Let an image speak. So in dreams, for example, we often rush to interpret the meaning of a dream. Bust out my whatever what's that book? Animals Speak. There's something about animals speak, I think. But it's this book where it's like, I had an eagle in the dream. Give me the book. Give me the book. Eagle. Okay. Entrepreneurial stuff. I knew it. I've been wanting to start my own Reiki business for, ages. That's it. The eagle told me Reiki business. Like, do you know what I mean? Like, so we do that all the time, though. I'm guilty of it too. Like, I always do stuff like that. And it's an impulse that we have. We're going to talk a lot about that impulse today when we talk about Jupiter. But try to find an image that fits, that's deep, that's vast, that's close to disaster, but there's innocence and beauty and magic mixed in. That's kind of the feeling. So that's what I thought I'd talk about today. All right, so let's go into Jupiter in Sagittarius. This happens soon, guys. It's really, really soon. Let's see. I'm going to pop the chart forward here. And when do we get it? It happens just as the sun is rising here on the East Coast. It's going to happen tomorrow between 6:44 a.m. and 7:44 a.m. Eastern Time, United States. So we're sitting right on the edge of a big change, Jupiter entering Sagittarius. Now, some things that I wanted to talk about today. We talked about, again, a lot of things yesterday. So again, if you're just joining, be sure that you check out my first video, because if I'm not covering something that you're interested in, I covered a lot of ground yesterday. Different take today. Today, I want to talk about some very particular teachings that are unique to Jupiter, and in some ways, Jupiter's relationship to Saturn. As Jupiter is going through Sagittarius in the next year, it will have a relationship to Saturn through an old kind of aspectual configuration that is called Antiscia. Now, Antiscia is a concept that I've covered in other videos. You can go back and search Antiscia in my YouTube files, and you'll find kind of more of a full treatment on it. But here's the gist of it. On the first day of Sagittarius and on the 29th day of Capricorn, there's an equal amount of light and darkness in the 24-hour period. On the second day of Sagittarius and the 28th day of Capricorn, there's an equal amount of light and dark. So you always take whatever degree equals the day. So the first day and the first degree of Sagittarius are basically the same thing. You take that degree and then you add the same, you add up a number from Capricorn that will give you 30 total degrees. So 14 Sag and 16 Capricorn, 13 Sag and 17 Capricorn, like that. And those days, if 1 degree equals 1 day in each sign, then those days are days where there will be an equal amount of light and dark. The difference is that during Sagittarius, the light is sinking. This is decline of the solar year. During Capricorn, the sun is starting to rise again in terms of its arc in the sky and the amount of light that we have in a 24-hour day here in the Northern Hemisphere. So there's an Antiscia relationship between the two, equal light, equal shadow. And one's waxing, one's waning, you could say. Capricorn's on the waxing side of the solstice and Sagittarius is on the waning side, but they're equal. So that means that they share, these two signs have a kind of secretive, hidden affinity. They don't have a Ptolemaic or a traditional configuration to one another. There is no aspect between the two of them, no line of sight aspect, as the word in the ancient tradition is connected to like optical theory, and the idea of being able to see one sign seeing another is what creates aspectual connections between planets when they're in the signs. So these two signs don't see each other, but they have a secret affinity for one another through this connection based around the solstice point, the winter solstice point. So Jupiter will have a kind of Antiscia secretive relationship with Saturn over the course of the next year, which is interesting because, of course, Saturn is right now in the sign of Capricorn. So we're going to talk about that a little bit as well. Let's start with some sort of teachings about Jupiter and Sagittarius. Jupiter and Sagittarius, a planet of faith, hope, growth, optimism, and the like, and moving into its home sign will more easily be able to address its needs and take care of those desires. So it's a year where there's sort of quintessentially more growth, faith, hope, charisma, confidence, inspiration, expansiveness, augmentation, blessings, good fortune, but also kind of, inflation, grandiosity, exaggeration, etc. Now, one thing that comes along with Jupiter, we're going to talk about some of the shadow sides of Jupiter and some of the opportunities of Jupiter in Sagittarius. One of them is that Jupiter in Sagittarius inspires within us our beliefs and convictions about things. So it's easy when Jupiter enters Sag for the next year to feel pretty fired up about things, to feel there's more faith, hope, confidence, charisma, ease, lightness, to just say what you believe, to just be in the confidence of your convictions, to have a sense of, you know, there's a kind of a way that you feel enlivened by what you believe. So, you know, sharing and expressing what you believe, it's as though it makes you feel better when Jupiter is in Sagittarius. And that's different than what we're used to over the past few years with Saturn going through Sagittarius, right? Where it was like, you know, I'm expressing what I believe, but I might want to try to make you suffer while I do it. You know what I mean? Where it's like I'm expressing what I believe, but I'm doing so in a way where I might be suffering the way that I express it. Either way, it's a little heavier with Saturn and Sagittarius. Jupiter and Sagittarius pretty light comparatively. This is one. There's an opportunity for us here within this transit. And that is that because it's just lighter and truly more jovial, truly more buoyant, and sort of it has more spring in its step and a little bit more confidence. There's less of that kind of heavy, you know, axe to grind or whatever when Saturn was in Sagittarius, is that we can more clearly discern the difference between a philosophy and a person. Let's break it down very simply. What is a philosophy and what is a person? Well, in the simplest terms, if we look at, you know, this from a sort of spiritual standpoint, a person in their true essence is an eternal spirit soul. Like you, me, Donald Trump, all of the people that we voted for, all the people that we didn't vote for, everybody is a person. Everybody is an eternal spirit soul. We have that much in common. Now, again, this requires some faith. You know, this may not be in the range of your beliefs, but that's certainly my belief. And I think most sort of spiritually minded people can agree to that. Our Constitution says as much. We are all created equal, right? So we all have this spiritual essence. We're all eternal, divine children of this amazing universe. We're all parts of the divine whole. And however, there's a difference between that and a philosophy. Now, philosophies, let's just agree that there is no philosophical explanation that can circumscribe the divine, right? I think that's pretty agreeable. Like our minds and the philosophies that even the ones that we receive that from divine sources, as well as the ones that we sort of discover in spirit of ingenuity, but our philosophies at the end of the day can't circumscribe the divine, right? We can't explain it all. It's and most of us would probably agree that it's a fool's errand to try and at least to try in a way that's, you know, kind of like, I'm going to get it all. So but we all believe that we are eternal spirit souls. And so very simply, the difference between a person, an eternal spirit soul, and a philosophy is that an eternal spirit soul is divine, perfect, and complete. Needs no qualification. A philosophy, on the other hand, is limited. Can't circumscribe the total, the sum total of all things. What was it in Shakespeare when, is it in Hamlet? There is more in heaven and earth than are dreamt of in your philosophies. I can't remember which part of the play that's in, but the same idea. So Jupiter in Sagittarius is a time when our philosophies can take us to new heights. We can be inspired to discover a philosophy or a theology or a belief or a practice that takes us beyond our current understanding. It can grow us, and there can be sparks or elements of truth, real truth, in the things that we begin to understand in the next year. But there is still, at the end of the day, a difference between a philosophy and a person. And the Jupiter and Sagittarius can give us an inspiration, truth, expansion, etc. But its real gift is also in giving us the kind of lightness that allows us to see the reality of the spirit soul. Any good spiritual philosophy highlights the importance of our spiritual dignity, that we're all equal on that level, of a spiritual level. So it's a great year, in other words, to be excited about growth, learning, adventure, faith, and hope in the spiritual realm, especially growing your faith. But it's also such a light transit that we can remember that there is a difference between a person and a philosophy. It's easier to confront and challenge a philosophy than it is a person. If we can do some healthy differentiating between the philosophies that we are being challenged by, or that we're learning and that we're growing by means of, and one another as people, we also stand to grow in a way that is very different from whatever it is that we might be learning. So you could be studying astrology, and you could be really growing in your understanding of astrology and getting pretty passionate about it, right? But then you start having debates with other astrologers about different things that you're passionate about. And the nice thing about Jupiter and Sagittarius is that it's so upbeat and buoyant that you can have those debates while remembering that this really, on some level, on some other level, has nothing to do with the love, respect, tolerance, or compassion that we have for one another. It sounds so simple, right? It's something that I think it's an ideal that we learn, like if you're in college and you're taught to have meaningful debates in your classrooms, or you're taught to have meaningful discussions around the dinner table with family. The idea is that the philosophies can be looked at, ideas can be exchanged, challenged, and so forth, but that we don't necessarily have to say, this is, well, I don't agree with you, and so I'm going to label, judge, or condemn you because I don't agree with you. Your morality to me is evil. Your political philosophy to me is evil. Like this. When our disagreements can't stay on the grounds of philosophical disagreements and remember each other's eternal spiritual natures, we really suffer. When we can't remember that and keep that up, we suffer. This is a transit with Jupiter and Sagittarius where we can grow by leaps and bounds in our knowledge and our understanding and wisdom and faith. We can easily make the mistake of thinking that somehow could possibly add to or subtract from our innate divinity. It can't. No matter what we learn, it doesn't add an iota of divine worth to us. No matter what we master or what political convictions we have, it doesn't take away anything from our eternal spiritual nature. If you believe that, right? If we believe that that's true, and if that becomes as firm a conviction as our philosophies, think of what meaningful conversations can be had. Think of what depths we can go to with one another in discussion. It's a different place to relate to one another from, but it requires that no matter how passionate we are, no matter how convicted we are about whatever, that we remember first that I'm a spirit soul and you're a spirit soul. It sounds very basic. It's sort of like Mr. Rogers basic. I love you just the way you are. You're a child of God just the way you are. It's that kind of basic philosophy that Jupiter and Sag can get puffed up, can get proud, can get so convicted and dogmatic that it forgets that. On the other hand, it's such a light, jovial, and again, buoyant transit that it's a great time to engage one another without making the mistake of turning it into personal attacks and name calling and feeling threatened and judging and all of this. So this is the first thing that I thought to mention today, is just that Jupiter and Sagittarius, it can intensify the learning and the expansion of knowledge and wisdom in our beliefs, and it can become dogmatic, or it can be light, and that's exciting to me, because I remember. Well, I'll come back to this later. I have another note on what I was about to say. Okay, so that's like thought number one for Jupiter and Sagittarius. The next one is a question that we're going to it's going to turn into a whole interesting conversation. I'm going to actually read you a short, very brief, like 2-page essay from James Hillman. This Jupiter in Sagittarius is also connected to the future. Jupiter is related to spring and life and abundance and growth, and those things are very closely related to the future. So this is a short essay by James Hillman, a famous archetypal psychologist, sort of like the prodigy child of Carl Jung. And this essay is called, "Is the Future an American Addiction?" Ideas are in short supply in the United States, to say nothing of big ones. We seem able to encourage ideas of only two poor sorts: great big fuzzy ones like growth, self, national security, freedom, commitment, community. Ideas that have neither arms nor legs and just roll around the various highways, clouding vision and blocking straightforward daylight. Or we have the other sort of ideas, what we call practical. How to avoid taxation with a leveraged buyout, concoct a pharmaceutical to avoid emotion, invent a canny little gimmick for fixing a faulty space station, or increase the speed of a transmission. So my first idea is that the greatest scarcity in the entire national enterprise today are ideas. Radical, effective, imaginative, grand ideas. They have fallen into unconsciousness. Moral ideas like justice, honor, dignity, courage, tragedy, veracity. Cosmological ideas like proof of God's existence, the nature of the good and the good of nature, the life of reason and the reason of life, the meaning of public, of city, of citizen, the relations between the arts and values, of why and for what do we human beings exist. We need ideas we can cogitate a long time rather than quick fixes. If we have a short-term economy, it is because we have short-term ideas good for only a quarter, not even a full year. We need tough, dense ideas that can be chewed rather than swallowed whole, thereby forming ill-digested ideologies. Idea, from the Greek eidos, is both something seen as an independent phenomenon, a form, a shape, something envisioned, studied, contemplated as an object, and it is something that allows you to see and make seeing possible. We see ideas as when we say, "Do you see what I'm saying?" Meaning, "Did you get my idea?" And we see by means of ideas. The classical world made statues of some ideas like truth, time, justice, charity, and victory, so that we could see them as objective figures, not merely as concepts made up by the human brain. Without ideas, it becomes quite difficult to notice anything. We become mentally blind, if not stupid. For instance, until you have the idea of a stellar constellation, the Big Dipper, say, the display of stars twinkling away in the night sky is just a jumble. No shape, no pattern. The idea lets you draw the lines between the dots. When microscopic viewing and staining occurs in the lab, it is well known that you cannot see and identify the particulars you are searching for until the idea of what exactly you are looking for becomes what you are looking at. Teachers in the lab teach what to see so that you learn how to see. What comes before how? I'll say that again. What comes before how? These little examples from the night sky and the glass slide point to an idea as a form, a shape, a configuration. And if an idea is truly something that pops into our mind or hangs around in a culture like a meme, awaiting rediscovery when the time is ripe or a person is clear enough to catch it and speak it, then indeed an idea is truly like a figure or form, a sort of invisible, non-human person. That's why the ancient Greeks, following Socrates, considered ideas to be forms, some of which were archetypal forms or archai, root ideas, big ideas, eternal ideas that govern the way things are in the world. The upshot of this little excursion on ideas, and important for us today, is the idea that the governing forms of our mind were expressed also by archetypal principles in the shape of gods and goddesses, and other personifications of myth. Thus, philosophy of knowledge, how we know anything, mythology, the study of the ways of the gods and goddesses, and psychology of living human existence were completely intertwined. I want to maintain that tangle alive and well. And my life's work has been and still is to add more complexity and pump fresh blood into the vital interplay between myth, thought, and actual life, the gods, ideas, and psychology. The particular idea for today is one called future. It doesn't come on stage all by itself. It is part of a gang. Other members of future's gang are called development, progress, acceleration, new, technology, prophecy, and two very rosy and seductive forms, one called hope and the other escape. Here I have divided future from its usual tedious and grammatical companions, past and present. In fact, I've removed future from its parents, time and alteration or change. This family is so abstract and conceptual without the meat and fat of soul. For soul, past time has another name, memory, and present, simple daily life. And future's soul name is fantasy. The separation of the idea of future from the idea of time takes a lot of doing. We have to do it again and again, for time, in our times, has caught us all. It feels the most real, the most commanding of all gods, and it will be a struggle today trying to examine the idea of future freed from the oppressive importance of time. Whoa, that is a freaking awesome essay, I have to say. But at any rate, Hillman's dropping some serious wisdom on us in that little essay. It's like 3 pages long, and you feel like you've been to like the most amazing, to me anyway, I'm like, that's like a cosmic rock concert of coolness. But this question, is the future an addiction? Jupiter in Sagittarius is deeply connected to the idea of newness, but newness is not always the same as the future. And yet, one of the easiest, most delusional things that can happen when Jupiter is in Sagittarius is the delusion of progress, future, hope. You know, what's next? What's the grand messianic salvation going to be? So these are the things that he takes some shots at, trying to say, you know, we need to understand bigness of ideas, grandness of ideas, which is Jupiter in Sagittarius. We need to understand it as something different from the literal concerns about outcomes in the future. Go back with me for a second to the time that you were 18 years old. Yesterday, I was in line voting at my local voting place, which is a Catholic church, and I was standing and watching as it was, you know, pouring down rain, a Scorpio moon. I was like, oh God. And it's the American flag is like sort of, you know, blowing a little bit. It just looks like really sad and sloppy. And then the church is right there in the distance. And I was like, church and state, here we are, you know, like just like such a heavy mood. Everyone is in line, like, you know, this is like this apocalyptic feeling. And I could feel it in the line. Like everyone is so concerned about outcomes. And I listened to an 18-year-old boy behind me who was voting for the first time. This was a Latino boy, and he was with his mom, and he was very excited to be voting and really super intelligent. And he was standing there having a debate with his mother. Quite clearly, they were Democrats. He was having a debate with his mother in line, and he was talking about his AP government class. He was like, so he was talking about what they were talking about in AP government. And he was basically what he was saying was, even though he was clearly with his mom and going to be voting a Democratic ticket or whatever, he was telling his mom why he could understand and appreciate the philosophical perspectives of people on the other side. He was trying to calm his mom down, because his mom was in a space where, she was concerned, really concerned, as we all are, and as we all have reason to be. But her concern was on outcomes. Her hope was invested in outcomes. Her ideas and her ideals were being put to a measurable test, as the world is sort of being tested in this moment, and it has to do with outcomes. It has to do with the future, right? He was voting for the very first time and experiencing the entire conversation about what's happening politically, nationally, and even that very act that he was about to do, voting for the first time, from the perspective of, yeah, the action matters, and yeah, the outcome matters, but he was trying to represent his understanding about the idea of the democratic process and the value of exchange between the left and the right, and so on and so forth. Now, some people right now, understandably, can't tolerate that. They would, like the mother who was talking to this young boy, would just say, you know what? You're a child. You're not living in the adult world where all the real stuff is happening, and you don't understand the consequences, the gravity of the situation, the life and death of the, like that. Fair criticism, right? I think a lot of us would feel sympathy for the mom who is trying to convince the son that no. This isn't just an AP debate that you're having with some of your Republican classmates, an AP government class debate or whatever. This is real. Like, and you could side with her, you could feel it. And I was listening to it and I felt it, and I was like, oh. And then I was listening to him, and he was like, yeah, but mom, like, I'm a younger generation, and I think my generation is more willing to talk about these things so he was more in the realm of big ideas that are not connected to the literalism of the future. Not that the future doesn't matter. That's not the point here. It's not at all what Hillman is saying, like the future doesn't matter. But it is to say that big ideas that matter to us are often inextricably bound and tethered to literal, concrete concerns and expectations that we have about future outcomes. And the important thing that I think that Hillman is trying to say in his essay is that sometimes we need, in order for ideas to change the world, we have to love ideas again, just as they are, without obsession about the future. The newness of ideas, the bigness of ideas, the contagiousness of ideas. It's like being 18, it's like being 20 in a college classroom where you have a debate, you go back to your dorm room, there's no real consequences in a sense yet. But that's exactly what Hillman is trying to make us understand, is that ideas have the power to change us and to transform the world in truly visionary ways when we allow them to be, without just being in service to a future, literal, concrete, material outcome. It's a very hard thing to differentiate. This is why I said there's a secretive relationship with Saturn in the midst of Sagittarius, because we think of hope, faith, belief, conviction, big ideas, and we can't help but separate it from it's a useless to have ideas unless it's connected to something that's going to propel me toward a future outcome. It's going to give me salvation. It's going to bring about the end times. It's going to deliver the fallen souls. It's going to save the republic. It's going to, you know what I mean? But the thing is that again, that reality will go marching on and on. The outcomes, their connection to our ideologies, like that's not going anywhere. So why can't we also have some revival of ideas for the sake of ideas, for what they can do in exchange? Why can't we embrace something more of what that youthful young man was saying in line at the voting booth yesterday? Okay, so I take that as an example. It's a very interesting thing to think about. Now, so it's very possible, in other words, that Jupiter in Sagittarius is about the dogma of futurism. So, for example, in the popular, New Age movement, a sort of New Age spirituality Notice how the word is new and age. New and age together means a progressive age, an age that is literally going to get better. Similarly, in many different religious traditions, especially those that come out of a more linear view of time, like those of Christianity, which there's a lot of elements of Christianity that I love, but when we have a more linear view of time, then what comes at the end really matters. You know what I mean? And when there's so much is put into that again and again, there becomes a dogma. Our ideas, which are glorious, beautiful creatures unto themselves, justice, faith, truth, all of these things, like they're archetypal, and they inspire us. But when they only become co-opted by a literal concern about a concrete objective future, they become dogma. Dogma can, in a not so positive sense, and a dogmatic in the negative sense. I have no inherent beef with the word dogma. I think it'd be used positively as well, but it becomes dogmatic in the negative sense. And that's really hard for us to imagine, because it's very, very difficult to take ourselves out of the literal concern about the literal outcomes in the literal future. But why would we want to do this? What does astrology have to say? Why wouldn't we do that? Why wouldn't we take that view of the future? Why wouldn't it matter? Are we just foolish? Like, again, can't you hear the mother's concern talking to her son? I want to read you something else. This comes from a passage from a book that I really love called The Shape of Ancient Thought. It is Comparative Studies in Greek and Indian Philosophies. This is just a simple couple of paragraphs. This is describing the kinds of philosophical beliefs and ideas that were common in both the Western sort of Greek-speaking Hellenistic world, as well as in the Eastern, Near Eastern and Indian world at the time that Hellenistic astrology, the earliest form of horoscopic astrology, was coming into existence. This circular view of time is part of the shape of ancient thought, and one of the major differences between ancient and modern attitudes. Most Indian and Greek philosophers taught such a view. In the early stages of the Greek tradition, versions of it are either found in the works of or attributed to Hesiod, Pythagoras, Anaximander, Anaximenes, Heraclitus, Diogenes of Apollonia, Xenophanes, and Plato, not to mention later schools like the Stoics, who were big into astrology. In India, it was the standard view of Hindu, Buddhist, and Jain philosophers. It was the most widespread, indeed the normal or ordinary view of time among ancient philosophers in both Greek and India. Judeo-Christian Islamic tradition has featured a linear view of time, while the seasonal cyclicity of the fertility calendar is echoed in the recurrence of holy days. Time overall is conceived as a straight line segment which began at a certain time, creation, and will end at a certain time, perhaps the Last Judgment. This view of time seems to have originated with Zoroaster and has since come to dominate the three Western religions whose view of time grew essentially from Zoroastrian origins. In the secularized West, a linear view still holds, usually as an expression of the idea of ongoing scientific, political, or social progress, but without clear enunciation of its beginning and end. So you have a whole chapter here that goes very deep into all of the comparative Greek and Indian Eastern philosophies that espoused a cyclical view of time. What does that mean? First of all, it means there is no ultimate creation or ultimate destruction of the material universe. So wrap your head around that for a second. But physicists are actually telling us something very similar. There's a guy named Neil Turok, who's a physicist who wrote a book called Endless Universe. And it's about the repeating cycles of contraction and expansion of multiverses. And this model that physicists are putting together suggesting basically the same thing, that time doesn't have a beginning or end, that it's cyclical. I have a friend of mine who wrote a book called Time Loops. He's a scientist, and he's writing about how precognition starts making sense when you look at time as circular. So at any rate, if many of you saw the movie The Arrival, or it was maybe just called Arrival, similarly, this very interesting alien language that is learned is also revealed at some point in the film to be a part of a cyclical understanding of time. That people loved this movie. It was fascinating. It something in us really connects to this idea. So let's just entertain for a second the idea that rather than time being linear, that it's cyclical. What does that mean for Jupiter and Sagittarius, who can bring newness, faith, hope, bigness of ideas, but also the dogmatic, almost hyper dogmatic concern with the future? Well, if Jupiter is the dogma of progress in the future, whether that's scientific progress, political progress, social progress, whatever, first of all, let's make a note. There is nothing wrong with progress. What we're trying to do here is look at the way that progress can become a dogma and actually eat away at the spirit of new ideas, or at the spirit of exchange of ideas that is more compassionate and understanding. If Jupiter is a sort of dogmatic ruler of the future as a shadow side, then Saturn can very easily be that is obsessed with the past, the bygone era. Saturn is the ruler of the golden age, the once king, and the one he's ended up being usurped by Zeus. The son usurps the father, the future usurps the past, right? And then Saturn is bitter, like, I want to go back to the past, or this was this golden age. And an embittered Saturn in a birth chart can very easily show up as someone who idolizes the past, who just wants to go back to the past, who gets stuck in the past, who can't get out of the way it should be, but isn't right now. And it once was. You know what I mean? So Saturn can be worshiping at the altar of the past, and that's just as problematic. Can't you see that in the division of, like, I mean, can't you see that on the in terms of like the phrase or slogan, "Make America Great Again"? There is a desire to go back to a bygone era. You know, it's nostalgic. So don't ever let someone tell you that Saturn is not unimaginative. Saturn's imagination often just goes backward. It often is more oriented toward the past. People who are interested in ancient astrology, you know, and they're like, oh, that new age bullshit, you know, it's like, let's go back to the roots where the real astrology is. I've been guilty of that attitude sometimes, and I notice that people who are into ancient astrology can sometimes get that attitude. That would also potentially be the dogma of Saturn in our own language, and we can't even recognize it sometimes. Okay, so Saturn can take us, you know, back to the past and get stuck in the literalness of the past. Well, it was good, but we've fallen. You know what I mean? Like that kind of attitude. And then usually, this is where that Antisha comes in. We need to get back there. But the back is just, it's the same it's co-opting Jupiter. But rather than looking at the future and newness, it's the progressive movement is now toward the past. In a circle, you can go in either direction. Doesn't matter. You can feel like I need to go backward, right? And yet, if you look at it, it's a circle, and so backward it doesn't matter which direction that you go in. They loop together, right? So the point is that Jupiter in Sagittarius can give us this sense of newness, faith, hope, but it can also, the dogma can get us caught in the idea that the literal future matters. Whether that future is thought of as, I need to go back to a bygone era, or everything is backward right now and I need to go forward to a brand new era, right? Back and forth. The two have a secret connection. This is in fact why throughout the vast history of astrology, what planetary conjunction marked the start of a new era more completely than any other pairing? The conjunctions of Jupiter and Saturn. Newness and oldness come together in that seed moment represents something that's truly sort of new. Why? Because it has something of the past, but it has something of the future, right? So it brings it together. These are very important moments in mundane predictions as well. Jupiter-Saturn cycles can bring the sort of new and old together in an interesting way. For example, think of Ronald Reagan in the early 1980s. You don't, like a lot of people don't like Ronald Reagan. Set that aside for a second and just look from 10,000 feet at what a unique kind of spirit he brought into politics at the time, and how he was something of the old and something of the new, and that's sort of what he was known for. So at any rate, that was a Jupiter-Saturn moment when he was sort of first coming into office. All right, so time as cyclical, if you embrace that idea, which ancient astrologers definitely did, it means that our attitudes about time, the future and the past, are themselves recurring archetypal attitudes, beliefs, or ideas that have seasons. So this is why Hillman said we have to do so much work to separate big ideas and the future from one another. And also we have to do so much work to separate the future from time. Because as long as we think of time as just marching forward into the future, and we don't see the past, the present, and the future as cyclical and recurring, then we get caught up in we get caught up in the gravity of what is coming in the future, right? And if it's just a linear march forward, we get caught up in the gravity of what's coming in the future. And then we start fighting. It's got to be like the past because we're slipping away. Make America great again. Or no, that's all evil, ignorant stuff from the past. We're evolving. It's a new age. It's a new moment. It's a new species. It's a new utopia, right? Go forward like that. But the real idea that's significant is the idea that the experience of time as something that's about the future or about the past, that those are archetypal qualities that we have that help us relate to time, and that the way that we relate to time is itself comes and goes, just like certain kinds of flowers sprout up at certain times of the year. And so sometimes we feel nostalgic for the past. We want to go back there. And when it tends to be activated? It often tends to be activated when there's been huge, long, sustained seasons of newness and growth and expansion. Then suddenly we want to cut back and conserve and go back. On the other hand, when do we want to leap forward? When there's been too much holding, constraining, confining. We've been stuck in the past. Then we need to go forward into the future. And that's how it works. It goes round and round like that. So our attitudes can change drastically. But if we forget the big picture, that our attitudes about time and reality are archetypal, ideas will not be able to be ideas. We cannot see ideas as gods if ideas are only in service to the archetypal complex that we are seized by, that has us literally concerned about the past or literally concerned about the future. Ideas will be co-opted by our delusions about the past or the future. If we can't understand those things as recurring, we will get lost in them. And then ideas can't be glimmering, glorious gods to relate to. Gods can't do their work. Like ideas, Hillman equating ideas with gods, they can't do their work unless we give them space to work without trying to co-opt them into what we need or want in the future. That's the simple message. It's not easy because we are so black and white in our thinking that we think it's impossible to believe something truly unless you are attached to an outcome. If you believe something and you don't believe that that belief is in service to an outcome, well, then you don't really believe. See what I'm saying? That is a lie, my friends. I was like, speak from my heart. Like, that is a lie. We don't have to believe that. We can be committed people who believe that our actions in the world matter. We can be people who fight the good fight, so to speak, and are convicted about our values, and we can still let ideas have a life of their own. We can separate the eternal spiritual person, the eternal spirit soul, from ideas. They can be exchanges. And that's how they were thought of. That's why ideas were given statues in the old world. It's very important because we can be possessed by these things. Having a statue for justice, for truth, for hope, or whatever, these statues help us remember so that when we're seized by hope and we go off crazy and all manic about it and get really destructive, we can remember, like, you can be like, hey, look, this, Lady Hope has got that one by the neck. You know what I mean? That's what having some literal, figurative place to embody ideas. We give them their autonomy. We get some distance from them. There's relational space. Where there's relational space, there's creative space. Beautiful things come out of creative space. So at any rate, think about the 1960s. The 1960s, it's this moment where there's a lot of cultural conservatism. And on college campuses all around the United States, there is an uprising of young people, youthful people, who want a different future, and they are entertaining big, amazing ideas. And the majority of college campuses during the 60s and the general mood in the United States was very, very conservative. So there's that season of time, season of newness, right? Okay, so it was Pluto, Uranus conjoining in the youthful, virginal sign of Virgo. So this kind of explosion, this upheaval of like radical new youthfulness. Jupiter's in on the mix during different times of that period as well. But you get the idea, right? In some ways, that march has gone on and on and on. To expect that there would never be, if you understand a cyclical nature of time, to think that there would never be an intense, conservative kind of, might feel regressive backlash or contractive period, if you are a student of history and if you're a student of the archetypes and if you're a student of astrology, would be absurd. So let me just give you a small example, though, of sometimes what happens when that same spirit of youthful progress becomes too dogmatic. We all know, I think, what ultra-conservative dogmatism looks like. It's very confining. Nobody likes it. Many people who are into astrology are pretty liberal and progressive, I think. But you know what a conservative feeling looks like. It's restrictive, it's limiting, and the newness comes as a result. We don't often understand the opposite way around and why periods of really heavy, contractive, conservative forces come back. We don't always have a good understanding of that. It's much harder for us to look at that in a sense, because even the language, harder, because it's more conservative, it's harder to even come to terms with. But let's give you a simple example. In 2011, approaching the 2012 winter solstice, I was giving a talk about astrology at an event. And it was an event with people who were, many of whom were very convinced by the 2012 Mayan prophecies that we were on the edge of a major leap collectively in consciousness that was going to happen at the 2012 winter solstice. And these are people that I would consider good, hopeful, big idea kind of people. And so, no one that I have any big disagreements with or anything. Anyway, I was giving a talk, and the talk was on the astrology of 2012 and beyond. And I talked about the fact that Pluto is in Capricorn, and I talked about the fact that Saturn would eventually be in Capricorn and stuff like that. There's a big Saturn-Pluto conjunction coming toward the end of the decade. And during that talk, I talked about exactly what I'm talking about now, about the cyclical nature of time in ancient astrology, more or less. And I said, I said, here's my concern, is that in our hopes and dreams for a better world, a literal sort of utopian leap in consciousness, I'm afraid that we are still taking on a kind of unconscious messianic religious complex, basically, that we're thinking too literally about everything becoming perfect and everything progressing, and there's a sort of something about this doesn't feel right to me. Not only that, but also when I examine a lot of the culture of the 2012 movement at the time, there was a self-righteousness in the air, an unstoppable force of progress, right? And an unstoppable force of progress that is connected to literal outcomes about what the world and what consciousness and what everything will be like and look like and feel like. And I said, and I'm worried that we're not taking seriously our Buddhist friends or our yogi friends. I'm worried that we're not taking the ancient philosophers seriously enough who saw time as cyclical and who would predict that where there is great expansion, there will also be great contraction. I'm worried that we're forgetting some of the ancient, words of Jewish wisdom. There is nothing new under the sun. I'm worried that we're forgetting some of those things, and that when we forget those things, they come back in as the shadow. They have a stronghold because we have become blinded by our Icarus wings taking us up. And I'm worried about that, right? And do you know what they did? They took the microphone away from me. That's literally what happened. They took the microphone away from me. So when we have, a lot of the times when we're so invested in the future and we are completely set on the future, our beliefs and our literal idea of what the future should look like, we're so invested in it, we can't separate our expectations, desires, and attachments in the future from our beliefs and ideas. Then we become intolerant toward others. And in that intolerance toward others, whether it's from the left to the right or the right to the left, it doesn't matter. We invite the opposite in a vicious cycle. That's what happens. And that's what happens, in some ways, I'm not convinced that there's much we can do about it. I don't mean that in a defeatist way. I mean, that's what cyclical time is all about. This is why many ancient cultures had the idea of there being light ages and dark ages and light ages and dark ages, like that. I'm struck by the idea that where real transcendence is possible is in the kind of consciousness we develop when we learn how to move in equanimity, compassion, and peace through these cycles. We play our role in the cosmic play. We're not here to duck out of it, okay? We play our role in the cosmic Shakespeare. We get into the stagecraft of it, but we don't forget this cycle. We don't forget that the expansions have contractions, right? Because if you do forget that, you lose your relationship to eternity. You lose your relationship to the ideas as gods. They disappear. They become expressions of neurosis, rooted in a future, rooted in the past, and we miss the eternal now. Plato said that time was a moving image of eternity, right? So how we're here to be really good method actors, I think, you know what I mean? But I think we have to also remember that we are actors on a stage. It's really, really important. And I think that's what astrology's insights have been about. That's what they've always been trying to communicate. So that's what I have for you guys today. I think one last question that I had received was, why did, like someone asked me recently, why did ancient astrology make a comeback? And I said, to the same basic reasons that conservative politics are making a comeback, or a conservative aura in general is making a comeback. It's a Saturnine kind of thing. It's not all bad, though. Do you know what I mean? Like, there's lots of ways in which something coming back from the past, or something of a more conservative tendency, can be a very good thing. It doesn't have to be just, heavy and oppressive or something like that. So I said ancient astrology comes back because when astrology reaches a point of maximal newness, and everything is about progressing, making astrology better, evolving astrology, when the mainstay of modern astrology in some ways is evolutionary astrology, the idea that life after life after life, you're in some kind of linear classroom moving toward enlightenment, moving toward progress spiritually. People get tired of that stuff after a while. It's not that it's not a valid spiritual paradigm. You can have a spiritual paradigm that's like that. That's fine. But people also get tired of progress. People get tired of progress. And one of the things that going back to the past does, in a good way, is reminding us that there is nothing new under the sun. Because if you're tired of progress, not everyone is, but if you're tired of progress, then a return to the past can easily be the thing that makes you say, yeah, and there's nothing really new under the sun. And that's certainly the view that, again, what does the Dalai Lama say about evolution and progress? He says, it's a kind of temporary illusion that can be helpful for spiritual life, but it's not really real. Sorry. That's the Dalai Lama saying that spiritual evolution is not exactly real. So the same kind of newness, spiritual progress, spiritual evolution, co-create your own reality. Everything's new. Everything's getting toward higher consciousness. Especially a younger generation that comes in and sees that philosophy as an expression of an older generation, it's natural to return to the past and to say, maybe we're interested in something that has a view of time and a view of spiritual life that's not so much about newness and progress, because maybe I feel like some of those ideas are actually old and boring now. That's where, in a sense, ancient astrology comes from. The problem comes when people then revert and say, well, ancient astrology is the right thing and all the New Age stuff is crap. That's when it becomes a problem. When ancient astrology, when the past becomes worship. Well, it's the original astrology, so it's better. It's the original rationale, so it's better. Now that would become problematic as well, in which case people could very well be like, I don't like this ancient astrology thing, just a bunch of jerks thinking that the past is better than some of the interesting innovations of the current moment. What are we going to, you want to wear togas and no longer take antibiotics? Do you know what I mean? So yeah, if it went back that way, it would be a problem. This is exactly why I'm passionate about building bridges between ancient and modern forms of astrology. I was born under a Jupiter-Saturn conjunction. That's what I'm interested in. I'm interested in that kind of where the new meets the old kind of thing. So I answer that question as a kind of sort of bookend to this conversation. I hope that this is something that is useful for all of you, that you've gotten some interesting philosophical insights out of this. This is a 3-part series. I'll have one more part tomorrow. It will not be as long as today's. Today's was kind of the meat of what I really wanted to get into. I thank you all so much for listening, and I'm very excited for this transit, and I'm going to get a shirt that says, let's make ideas again. And if you're interested, again, in the books that I looked at today, The Shape of Ancient Thought by Thomas McEvilley, and Philosophical Intimations is a collection of essays by James Hillman. And the particular essay that I read was, where was it? It's called Is the Future an American Addiction? Okay. Take care, everyone. Bye.